Thank you for joining me for some more Southwest desert stories while you relax or drive. Today, we will delve into stories on the Pueblo Native Americans. If you enjoy these tales, leave a like or comment. For further desert romps, hit the subscribe button. This account comes from the astonishment first expressed in the late 19th century that even in recent American history, thriving belief and fear of witchcraft persisted in certain corners of the Southwest. Our story begins when writer Charles Fletcher Lummis, who lived from 1859 to 1928, journeyed to New Mexico. This video is made from an excerpt of his book called Some Strange Corners of Our Country, The Wonderland of the Southwest, which was written in 1892. When the author first relocated to New Mexico, he expected to settle into normal life as an American citizen. However, he immediately found himself plunged into a worldview more reminiscent of medieval Europe than the modern United States. It often made me pinch myself to see if I were not dreaming, he writes. But the belief in witches and their dark powers was a disorienting reality here. He felt he had left the country he knew for one deeply invested in the supernatural. His native neighbors discussed witchcraft openly and seriously. He often heard chilling warnings to be careful of her, she's a witch. People would point out those reputed to be witches. More disturbing still, some faced violent punishments and executions after formal accusations of practicing witchcraft. The population in New Mexico in the late 19th century numbered about 175,000 people, but European settlers only accounted for 25,000 compared to 30,000 Native Americans and 120,000 Hispanics. Among these communities, belief in witchcraft colored every aspect of life. The local native tribes like the Pueblos and Navajos had especially intricate witchcraft beliefs. Their customs around protecting against, identifying, trying, and eliminating presumed witches developed over centuries. For example, when Pueblo parents have a child, ceremonies begin immediately to guard its soul from abduction by witches. Later in life, suspicious signs like red eyes, evidence of long nights rather than peaceful sleep, can mark someone as an ominous witch. Finding items tied to witchcraft magic like feathers of certain birds in someone's home could condemn them. When members of their society died, complex rituals lasting 4 full days followed. The tribes believed souls traveled to the afterlife over this time. The ceremonies intensely focused on disguising and misleading any witches chasing after the soul so they could not capture it in transit. Without these careful protections, newly deceased souls might face a terrible fate indeed. When crops failed, animals sickened, disease spread, or anything unfortunate occurred, suspected witches often bore blame from their fearful neighbors. Some also believed witches could transform into animal shapes, fly vast distances, and convene ritual meetings. The tribes viewed their spiritual leaders and medicine men as solemn guardians against this menace. The first duty at tribal rituals, dances, or any ceremony was driving off and punishing lurking witches. If conviction occurred after accusation, professional witch guards executed the guilty. One Pueblo village, Sandia, declined towards possible extinction from enthusiastically killing off presumed witches. In the author's village, the Tigua people distrusted approximately half their 1,100 population as witches. Only real fear of swift intervention by the 25,000 American populace living 12 miles away prevented outright violent purging. But they still imprisoned and physically punished some alleged witches, hoping to escape American notice. Just before the author arrived, the Tiguas executed the man living 2 doors down from him at midnight. Later, they imprisoned and tortured a young man whose only crime seems to have been witchcraft suspicion from his enemies. The author struggled to reconcile such horrors with the Tigua's otherwise normal lives as parents and neighbors. To outside observers, these events seemed unjust murders, but within the tribes, formally convicting and executing presumed witches appeared as proper administration of justice. Their supernatural fears erased moral hesitation in destroying those believed to use black magic against them. A less ritualized but equally unsettling witchcraft culture prevailed among the far more numerous Hispanic community. Just as with native tribes, magic and witch fear imbued ordinary aspects of life. Seeking advantages over enemies or explanation for misfortune, many Hispanics felt comfortable attributing problems to sorcery. The author writes even intelligent, educated acquaintances sincerely blamed unfortunate events on revenge by those with witchcraft powers. In fact, the Hispanic community once formally tried and executed convicted witches under Spanish courts. Though authorities no longer allowed this, belief still ran deep. In recent years before the author arrived, 2 men beat an elderly Hispanic woman to death. They genuinely thought she had used dark magic against them and deserved death. More educated Hispanics might not go so far as murder, but intense fear of curses from witches caused them to give favors and gifts when solicited, no matter how high the price. The author writes, "Few dare eat anything offered by a witch, lest it place a curse upon them." And many local Hispanics had astounding stories blaming unfortunate fates on witchcraft. For example, a number of men confided to the author that witches had briefly transformed them into women. Their only relief came from paying opposing witches an exorbitant amount to change them back. Others talk earnestly of witches stealing their eyes and legs, physically attacking them for offenses, or colluding to ruin their lives. The tales even get more bizarre. A drunken man kicked a witch, provoking her to use powers to grow a live mouse inside his stomach. It tormented him painfully until he acquiesced to rich gifts for the offended witch. Superstitions persist around witch shape-shifting. Unusual animals sighted near homes at night likely serve as witches in transformed bodies. Even shooting stars convey fearful meaning, a sign of gathered witches traversing the night sky. Yet, however supernatural and unreasonable their claims to outsiders, those inside the Mexican witchcraft culture hold them as utterly sincere truth. This staggering realization perplexed the writer as he immersed in their world. Eventually, the author describes his own reluctant entanglement with regional witchcraft beliefs. He recounts having his left arm paralyzed following a minor blood vessel rupture in the brain. Despite possessing normal sensation, he lost motor control for over 3 excruciating years. His community of native neighbors, of course, dismissed entirely the medical explanation. To them, it was laughably obvious he had been afflicted by one among the witches thought to bedevil their village. Their spiritual beliefs allowed no other possibility. They smiled with a pitying superiority at the silly idea of mere biology causing such an injury. Some kindly suggested the author follow their customary practice, accuse whichever witch he believed was responsible so the medicine men could eliminate them. Continuing to assert medical facts clearly confirmed their view that another witch cured him later via the payment described by others. What conclusions can one draw from this immersion with neighbors who view the world so differently through a lens of witches, magic, and supernatural habits? The author struggles to convey the extent that these beliefs conflict with modern U.S. society surrounding New Mexico in the late 19th century. On one hand, he admits that the fantastic stories and rituals seem farcically childish and unreasonable to scientific thinking. It feels absurd to give them serious consideration. Yet, tens of thousands of fellow U.S. citizens as voters and community members cleaved passionately to this spiritual view as core truth. It puzzles him to realize that only minimal time separated these neighbors from colonial-era Europeans or Americans who embraced witchcraft as fervently as science. And despite relentless modernization and integration, echoes of these beliefs in witches and their conjured malice continue rippling through the Southwest among descendants of early Hispanic and Native residents to this very day. The author's experience leaves a provocative portrait of the thin line between rational progress and fearful superstition within human society and memory. There were a variety of rites of passages for entering different groups in the Southwest Pueblos. A young boy named Refugio faced a rite of passage into manhood that would seem almost unimaginable to most modern Americans. At the age of 12, Refugio was initiated into the Puebloan, a sacred order that serves as both armed guards for the medicine men and police against witches. This video is made from an excerpt of Charles Fletcher Lummis's book, Some Strange Corners of Our Country, The Wonderland of the Southwest, written from his experiences in New Mexico in 1892. Refugio's initiation had its roots in his infancy, when he was a sickly child. To restore his health, his parents gave him to the gray-haired chief of the Puebloan. The old shaman became Refugio's medicine father and visited him daily, along with other members of the order in descending rank. These regular visits continued for years, providing Refugio with a thorough education in the customs and lore of his people, which require prodigious feats of memorization since the Pueblos have no written language. Refugio's initiation day finally arrived. He had to fast for a full 24 hours. At sundown, he entered the medicine house with his medicine father, both removing their moccasins at the door out of respect. In the dark room lit only by the flickering sacred fire, the elders of the order waited, seated in a semicircle. Refugio kept his head bowed as his medicine father prayed, invoking the truths of the east, north, west, south, above, and center in precise order, as mixing up the sequence is taboo and seen as the work of witches. The first trial Refugio faced was smoking the weir, a sacred cigarette made of a special reed that can only be lit from the sacred fire. Refugio had to smoke the harsh, pungent weir to the last puff, inhaling every wisp of smoke. The first few puffs turned his face gray, but he managed to consume it completely without letting any smoke escape his mouth, as required. Refugio was then ritually cleansed with warm water by the first assistant of the chief shaman. Over the next several days and nights, Refugio had to learn a great number of sacred songs by heart, including the lengthy Song of the Sun that honors the Sun Father Tahuride. Refugio mastered this long song in less than half the time it later took the author to learn it. Once Refugio had memorized all the songs, the elders performed the receiving or tho ashur ceremony, each one embracing him in turn and giving him the sacred drink pa quin pa, which has a sweet smell but no taste. For the final trial, Refugio had to sit motionless and attentive for a full 49 hours as the elders took turns reciting the complete history and customs of the Puebloan, beginning with the mythical emergence of the first people from the Black Lake of Tears. Refugio had to remain alert the entire time, answering, "Ta kun nam, is that so?" at the appropriate moments in the story. When he nodded off once, he was poked hard in the ribs with the end of a bow. After passing this last grueling test, Refugio was once again embraced by all the members and formally declared a full Puebloan, earning the right to smoke tobacco, a rare privilege for a boy so young under Pueblo custom. But this marked only the beginning of Refugio's arduous lifelong training as a medicine man protector. He would need to acquire secret healing arts, fast for up to 8 days at a time, many mortifications of the flesh, and practice constant self-denial, all to fulfill his essential duties of securing blessings and guarding the welfare of the nearly 1,200 people in his village. Refugio would command immense respect, but at the price of a lifetime of sacrifice and weighty responsibility. Welcome to this Southwest Desert video on the story of Fray Marcos de Niza, a Franciscan priest who in 1539 embarked on a perilous journey through the American Southwest seeking the mythical 7 cities of gold, known as Cibola. This account comes directly from the detailed report Marcos wrote after his expedition. Through this episode, we will recount his remarkable tale just as Marcos described it in his own words centuries ago. Our story begins in 1539 within the Viceroyalty of New Spain, comprising Mexico and parts of Central America under Spanish colonial rule. For years, rumors had been circulating of wealthy indigenous cities somewhere north of Mexico, perhaps vestiges of the legendary 7 cities of gold sought since the 8th century, when 7 bishops supposedly fled Moorish forces in Spain with a contingent of followers. These persistent tales of cities abundant with gold, silver, and gems continued to ignite the imagination of Spanish conquistadors and Catholic missionaries in the 16th century. Eager to locate any grain of truth behind such legends, the Viceroy Antonio de Mendoza sponsored an expedition headed by Fray Marcos de Niza, a Franciscan priest who had previous experience in the Americas. Marcos readily accepted the challenging assignment, enticed both by missionary zeal and prospects of fame should he verify the existence of such rumored cities. Accompanying the priest was a Moorish former slave named Estevanico, referred to as Estevan, the lone survivor out of just 4 men who endured an arduous 9 years wandering the wilds of the American Southwest after a disastrous 1527 Spanish maritime expedition. Regaled during this odyssey as a powerful healer and magic worker, Estevan cultivated an aura of shamanistic authority that lent credibility to his second-hand sightings of wealthy cities, later dubbed Cibola. The Viceroy calculated Estevan could employ this stature and familiarity with indigenous peoples to help locate any evidence behind those persistent stories of cities rich in resources. On March 7, 1539, Fray Marcos, along with Estevan, another friar named Fray Honorado, and a large contingent of native porters, soldiers, and interpreters embarked north from the town of Culiacan in western Mexico towards the Arizona and New Mexico deserts. Estevan took the lead as the expedition's scout into the vast unknown terrain, while Fray Marcos followed around a month behind. Fray Marcos later wrote that he and Estevan agreed upon signals to indicate if the Moor encountered settlements reflecting different degrees of wealth as measured by Spanish standards. According to Marcos, if it were but a mean thing, Estevan should send me a white cross of 1 handful long, and if it were of any great matter, one of 2 handfuls long, and if it were a country greater and better than Nueva España, New Spain, he should send me a great cross. Working ahead of the main party, Estevan dispatched messengers within several days, confirming discovery of a new province 30 days' travel distance containing major cities, relaying a towering cross signaling expected bounties even greater than the Aztec capital. Encouraged by this news, Fray Marcos pressed northwards through difficult terrain and uncertain tribal receptions, still waiting to rendezvous with Estevan near the purported cities where they could both observe the rumored riches. However, before rejoining his scout, Marcos instead encountered fearful native runners, reporting that Estevan had been warned to stay away from a Zuni pueblo called Hawiku, but had refused to heed these threats. More wounded members from Estevan's group soon appeared, confirming the Moor had suffered mortal injuries in a violent clash at Hawiku, provoked by his attempt to enter the settlement against explicit objections. Although deeply shaken by his scout's dramatic death, Fray Marcos insisted on pushing towards Cibola to finally witness this destination for himself, thereby justifying the entire expedition back to New Spain authorities. After 12 exhausting days trekking north, a determined Marcos reached a high enough vantage point to glimpse the mysterious Hawiku complex that had just spelled doom for the overconfident Estevan. In Marcos's report on Cibola to Viceroy Mendoza, he describes the settlement's impressive scale and architectural features as best his distant inspection allowed, claiming, "I followed my way until I came within sight of Cibola, maketh show to be a fair city, and is better seated than any I have seen. The houses are builded in order, all made of stone, with diverse stories and flat roofs." Yet still shaken by his previous courier's fate, Fray Marcos declined to fully approach Hawiku himself, admitting, "I returned with much more fear than vit uls." Though Marcos only distantly observed this reputedly resplendent settlement, he had now visually confirmed a sizable inhabited place broadly matching prior second-hand tales of large, wealthy cities in the north. His tantalizing relayed descriptions electrified the imagination of colonial Mexico. The next year, Marcos led an immense military contingent under Francisco Vázquez de Coronado on a full-fledged expedition to conquer the civilizations Marcos certified during his initial reconnaissance. Instead of submitting gold and silver riches for pillage, however, these Zuni and Hopi Pueblos complexly organized their lives around agriculture, kin networks, and rich cultural traditions rather than European notions of status and material wealth so enthralling to the invaders. With no cities made of literal gold waiting to deliver riches into Spanish coffers, Coronado declared Marcos a deceiver and the expedition a debacle. Yet despite this indignity, Fray Marcos still trailblazed Spanish ambitions by verifying bases for legends of advanced settlements in the uncharted northern deserts, thereby opening the door for eventual expansive colonization and missionary activities in what is now New Mexico and Arizona. I hope you enjoyed this telling of what Marcos himself recorded during his trek towards the Seven Cities almost 500 years ago, when expectations and realities tragically collided on the remote fringes of Spain's ascendant New World empire. August of 1680, a meticulously planned revolt erupted across the deserts, mesas, and Sangre de Cristo mountains of northern New Mexico. An unlikely alliance formed between 20,000 Native Americans, Pecos, Zuni, Hopi, and Acoma, from 60 pueblos scattered across 70,000 square miles, who had 4 distinct languages and several dialects. They united to drive out the Spanish colonists who had controlled the region for nearly a century. They launched one of the most successful uprisings against European settlers in all of North America during the colonial era. Over the next 12 days, this event, now known as the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, showed the unbelievable resolve of an oppressed people pushed to the brink. Fueled by spiritual convictions and a refusal to abandon ancestral traditions, the outnumbered Pueblo fighters evicted settlers, monks, and governors alike from their homeland. They dealt both a symbolic and strategic blow against the expansionist Spanish Empire. Our story begins in the Kivas of Taos Pueblo in 1675, where a medicine man named Pope plotted rebellion after being imprisoned by Spanish authorities for idolatry and evil-doing. Using clever tricks like covering his body with flaming phosphorus, Popeye convinced the Pueblos that their gods sanctioned an uprising to overthrow their Spanish overlords. The Pueblos had many grievances under Spanish rule. They were forced to provide tribute labor and products. Their religious practices were banned, and they blamed droughts and disease on the failure of Spanish religion. Popeye united a network of far-flung pueblos, sending knotted cords to signify the revolt date. However, when some plotters wavered and Spanish officials captured runners, Popeye showed his ruthlessness by killing his own son-in-law for suspected betrayal. Because of this, he moved up the revolt date. On August 10, 1680, a horrific, coordinated massacre began across New Mexico as Pueblos rose up, resulting in over 400 Spanish deaths. Friars were martyred in hideous ways, with one padre scourged through a village naked and tied astride a pig until he perished. Spanish settlers fled to Santa Fe. After destroying the remote areas, Pueblo warriors surrounded the capital, using a clever ruse to cut off Santa Fe's water. After 2 days without water and failed negotiations, the beleaguered Spanish retreated south towards Mexico in what an Indian victory song called the Death of the Spanish Gods. With the Spanish gone, Popeye banned his followers from speaking Spanish or uttering Christian names, scrubbing themselves in rivers to remove traces of baptism. After destroying all Catholic symbolism, traditional dances and kivas were revived and old idols restored. But Popeye soon exploited his heroic status. Clad in finery, he traveled through pueblos, extracting obedience and tribute like a dictator, falling into civil war-inducing decadence before dying in disgrace. Though Spain retook New Mexico in 1692 after years of conflict, the revolt dealt them a lasting blow. It enabled Pueblos to preserve more of their old religion, with Spanish authorities adopting increased tolerance after reconquest. So as we marvel at enduring Pueblo dances today, we have crafty manipulator and flawed liberator Popeye to thank for this cultural legacy. The Pueblo Revolt deserves more prominence as a transformational event in early Southwestern history. For over 12 years, it completely overturned colonial rule in New Mexico. Its complex legacy continues to shape Pueblo cultural persistence today. It provides potent lessons on the power of united action in the face of injustice, and how people can successfully defend human rights and sacred lifeways against imperial oppression. Thank you for joining me on this journey through Southwest history. Welcome to another episode of the Southwest Desert. We'll be taking an in-depth look at the fascinating world of the Pueblo Native Americans, a Native American group that has defied stereotypes and conventions for centuries. The information for this video is taken from an excerpt of Charles Fletcher Lummis's book, Some Strange Corners of Our Country, The Wonderland of the Southwest, written in 1892. When most people think of Native Americans, they often picture nomadic tribes living in temporary structures like wigwams and teepees. However, the Pueblo Native Americans of the American Southwest have been building and inhabiting permanent, multi-story dwellings since long before the arrival of Europeans in the New World. The Pueblos are the only native group in North America above Mexico that has always lived in permanent houses. When Columbus was still trying to convince the Old World of the existence of the New World, the Pueblos were already living in their comfortable and lofty tenements, some of which were 4 to 6 stories high and contained up to 500 rooms. The origins of these structures remain a mystery, as they predate even the arrival of the Spanish in the Americas. Enjoy this adapted desert commentary from a late 19th century historian. The most striking example of a still inhabited Pueblo village is Taos in northern New Mexico, which consists of just 2 buildings, each 5 to 6 stories tall and containing around 300 rooms. Other notable pueblos include Acoma, with 6 3-story buildings, and Zuni, featuring a colossal 6-story structure sprawling over several acres. Hundreds of ruins of these massive complexes are scattered across the American Southwest, standing as testaments to the Pueblo's architectural prowess. The Pueblo villages were constructed of expertly assembled stone masonry, using only simple tools. The builders had no metal of any sort and therefore could not dress stone, as many superficial observers have supposed they did, but selected sandstones and limestones which broke naturally into rather regular shapes, and laid these in mud mortar with remarkable skill. The buildings were designed with defense in mind, featuring windowless lower exteriors and restricted access via retractable ladders. The stacked terrace design allowed inhabitants to retreat upwards if the ground level was breached, and the rooftops served as elevated battlement platforms. The architecture of the Pueblos is unique and characteristic, and their original houses look unlike anything else in the world. They are all terraced, so that the front of a building looks like a gigantic flight of steps. The second story stands well back on the roof of the first, which thus gives it a sort of broad, uncovered porch its whole length. The third story is similarly placed upon the second, and so on up. There are no stairs inside even the largest of these buildings, except sometimes ladders to go down into the first story when that is built in the old fashion without doors. All these architectural peculiarities were for purposes of defense. The lower story was a dead wall, into which no enemy with only aboriginal weapons could break, and some of these walls have laughed at civilized field pieces. The ladders could easily be drawn up, and the level roofs made an excellent position from which to rain stones and arrows upon a foe. Even if the enemy captured the first roof, the people had only to retire to the second, from which they could fight down with undiminished advantage. Inside, the Pueblos lived tidy, comfortable lives in meticulously maintained rooms, complete with plaster walls, pine rafters, and small windows. Nearly every room has its queer southwestern fireplace, in which the sticks are burned on end. Those for heating alone are very tiny and stand in a corner, but the cooking fireplaces often fill one side of a room, and under one of their roomy hoods nearly a dozen people could sit. These Pueblos natives are peaceable and industrious, good hunters and brave warriors when need be, but quiet farmers by profession, as they were when the outside world first found them. They have always elected their own officials, and they obey the laws both of their own strange government and of the United States in a way which they certainly did not learn from us, for there is no American community nearly so law-abiding. They are entirely self-supporting and receive nothing from our government. They are not poor nor lazy, and they do not impose servile tasks upon their wives. One of my Pueblo neighbors in Isleta lent the hard cash to pay off our troops in New Mexico during the Civil War. Quite as interesting and remarkable as the best types of present Pueblo communal houses are the ruins of their still more ancient homes. It was long supposed that the so-called cliff builders and cave dwellers were of an extinct race, and much more of silly and ignorant surmise than of common-sense truth has been written about them. But as soon as there was any really scientific investigation of the Southwest, like Bandelaire's wonderful researches, the fact was fully and finally established that the builders of these great ruins were nothing in the world but Pueblo Indians. They have not vanished, but simply moved for a variety of reasons, and their descendants are living to this day in later Pueblos. Indeed, we now know the history of many of these ruins, and the Indians themselves. The Pueblos used always to build in places which nature herself had made secure, and generally upon the top of mesas, or islands of rock. Those who settled among the peculiar terraced canyons which abound in some parts of the Southwest usually built their towns upon the shelves of the cliff, while those whose region furnished precipices of easily carved stone hollowed out caves therein for their dwellings. It all depended on the locality and the surroundings. A canyon of the cliff builders is a wonderfully picturesque and interesting place. The stratification was a great help to the builders of these strange chasm towns, and doubtless first suggested to them the idea of putting their houses there. The cliffs are many times as far apart in such a canyon at their tops as at the bottom. Sometimes there is a perennial stream at the bottom, but oftener in this arid region the dry season leaves only a chain of pools, which were, however, adequate for the water supply of these communities. The several lower shelves of the gorge were never built upon, and the water was all carried several hundred feet up the cliff in earthen jars or tight-woven baskets. Such inconvenience of the waterworks has never deterred the Pueblos, and it is a striking commentary upon the savage dangers of their old life to see at what a fearful expense of toil they brought water any distance to a place that was safe. At Acoma to this day, every drop of drinking water is brought in jars half a mile over an enormously difficult cliff trail, and in some of the old-time Pueblos the daily water journey was even worse. But safety was before water, and so the swarthy people built their homes far up the side of the cliff, and there was a great saving of labor in another way. As a rule, the alternate strata in those canyons are of different kinds of rock and unequally eroded. Between each pair of harder strata, the softer intermediate one had been so gnawed out by wind and water that its neighbors above and below projected many feet beyond it, the lower one always farthest. So there the cliff builder found that nature had made ready to his hand 3 of the 6 sides of every room. The smooth, solid rock of the shelf was his floor, and a narrow but endless porch outside as well. The overhanging rock of the ledge above was his roof, frequently a very low one, but certainly watertight, and the face of the intermediate stratum was his back wall. He had only to build 3 little stone walls from stone floor to stone roof, a front wall and 2 end walls, and there was his house. These cliff rooms were extremely small, varying according to the strata, but seldom more than 12 feet long, 8 or 10 feet deep, and 5 to 8 feet high. In many of them no ordinary person could stand erect. There were seldom any windows, and the doors, which served also as chimneys, were very low and but 12 to 18 inches wide. An enemy at the very door would be so crouched and cramped in entering that those within could take him at a disadvantage. There are several of these canyons of the cliff builders easily accessible from Flagstaff, Arizona. They are gigantic gashes in the level uplands. One comes to their very brink without the remotest suspicion that such an abyss is in front. One of these canyons is over 20 miles long and in places 600 feet deep. It contains the ruins of about 1,000 of these small cliff houses, some of which are very well preserved. In most of these houses there is little to be found. The floors are 1 and 2 feet deep with the dust of ages, mingled with nutshells and thorns brought in by the rock squirrels which are now the only tenants. Digging is often rewarded by finding fine stone axes, beautiful agate arrow points, the puzzling discoidal stones, and even baskets of yucca fiber, exactly like the strange plaques made in Moqui or Hopi today. The baskets crumbled to dust soon after they were exposed to the air. There are few other countries so dry that a basket of slender vegetable threads would hold its patterns for 400 years or more under a foot of soil. Between the small cliff houses already described and the cave dwellings there is a very curious link: houses, or even whole towns, built in a natural cave. Montezuma's castle is such a one, and there are many others. These caves are not, like the Mammoth Cave, great subterranean passages, but great hollows, generally like a huge bowl set up on edge in the face of the cliff. They absolutely protect the enclosed town above, on both sides, and generally also below. They are usually high up from the bottom of the cliff, and between them and the foot is a precipitous ascent which no enemy could scale if any resistance whatever were made. Such towns could be captured only by surprise, as we know that in very rare cases some were captured. Some observant but uninformed travelers have been sadly misled by the regular round cavities which are found in the ground near these lofty pueblos, and have taken them for water tanks. Such a notion could arise only from entire ignorance both of the history and the ethnology of the Southwest. These circular cavities are the remains of the estufas, or sacred rooms of the men, which were generally made underground. The roofs have long ago disappeared and only these pits are left. They never had anything more to do with water than the fireplaces had. The Pueblo reservoirs were something entirely different. These huge houses were generally far from regular, for the simple reason that there never was a master architect to control the structure. Every family built its part of the tenement to suit itself. There could be no bossing in such things, for Native Americans are essentially tribal, and under that organization anything like a feudal authority is an absolute impossibility. Still, the builders agreed fairly well as to the general plan, and the great structure was sometimes very symmetrical. The romantic cueva pintada, which not a dozen white men have ever seen, is a very good type of these caves on a smaller scale, being only some 50 feet in diameter. It looks very much like the bowl of a gigantic ladle set into the cliff 50 feet above its foot. It contains several cave dwellings but no houses of masonry, though these occur at other points of the cliff. The most extensive and wonderful cave communities in the world are in the Great Cochiti Upland, some 50 miles northwest of Santa Fe. The journey is a very laborious one, but by no means dangerous, and if you can get a good Native American guide, you are apt to remember it as the most interesting expedition of your life. The country itself is well worth a long journey to see, for it is one of the wildest in North America. The enormous plateau is split with canyons from the mountains to the deep Warren River, and the mesas which separate them are long triangles which break off in 1,000-foot cliffs in the chasm of the Rio Grande, their narrow points looking like stupendous columns, whence they get their Spanish name potreros. In this noble and awesome wilderness, several tribes of Pueblo Native Americans dwelt in prehistoric times. It probably did not take them long to learn that in such a country of soft cliff, it was rather easier to dig one's house than to build it, even when the carpenter had no better tools than a sharp splinter of volcanic glass. In the superbly picturesque canyon of the Rito de los Frijoles is the largest of all villages of caves, deserted for more than 400 years. Outside its unnumbered cave rooms were more rooms yet, of masonry of bricks cut from the same cliff. A few miles farther up the Rio Grande, on the top of the Great Plateau nearly 2,000 feet above the river, are two huge castle-like buttes of chalky tuff, each some 200 feet high. They are the most easily accessible of the large cave villages of North America, being not over 10 miles from the little railroad town of Espanola. One can clamber up a trail on either side of the Santa Clara Canyon to the plateau at the top, and thence less than an hour's walk will take one to either of these great aboriginal honeycomb homes. The Puyai, which is on the south side of the canyon, is the largest and has many hundreds of cave rooms. They are burrowed out everywhere in the foot of the perpendicular white cliff, in tiers one above the other to a height of 3 stories. The caves are small, generally round rooms 8 to 12 feet in diameter, with arched ceilings and barely high enough to allow a man to stand upright. The old smooth plaster on the walls remains to this day, and so do the little portholes of windows and the niches for trinkets. Upon the top of the cliff, and in an almost impregnable position, are the ruins of a large square pueblo built of blocks of tuff. In this same wild region are the only great stone idols, or, to speak more properly, fetiches, in the United States, the mountain lions of Cochiti. They are life-size and carved from the solid bedrock on the top of two huge mesas. To this day, the Native Americans of Cochiti before a hunt go to one of these almost inaccessible spots, anoint the great stone heads, and dance by night a wild dance which no white man has seen or ever will see. The Pueblo Native Americans' architectural feats and thriving communities serve as a powerful reminder of the diversity and complexity of Native American societies. Their enduring legacy challenges our preconceptions and invites us to deepen our understanding of the rich histories and cultures that have shaped the American experience. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the fascinating world of the Pueblo Native Americans. I hope you enjoyed these adventures into the Southwest Pueblos. Please leave a like or comment. For further desert journeys, hit the subscribe button. Happy trails!